Welcome to Inside Academia, the weekly program where we take a look behind the ivory curtain seeking a frank discussion of American education. I'm your host, Andy Nash. My guest today is Dr. Richard E. Redding. He's an Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Law and Professor of Psychology at Chapman University School of Law. He's also co-author and co-editor of the 2009 book, The Politically Correct University: Problems, Scope, and Reforms. Dr. Redding, welcome to Inside Academia.
Thank you.
What was the impetus for writing this book, along with your co-editors, co-authors, and the many people that have contributed to this collection of essays?
Well, I've always been a policy wonk, very interested in political and policy issues. And one thing I noticed as I was going through my graduate and law school education is the relative lack of voice given to conservative, and I use the term conservative broadly defined to mean anything right of center. Conservative perspectives on policy issues, on the hot issues of the day in class and scholarship coming out of the academy and so forth. And so it's a topic I've always been interested in. One can go back as long ago as the 1930s to find people talking about the problem that colleges and universities tilt to the left. But it's been largely anecdotal. People were recounting stories and experiences. So what we set out to do in this book was to address the issues systematically from an empirical perspective, to ask the question, does the problem really exist, or is it just a series of anecdotes, and to explore that issue through some large-scale empirical studies. And then if it exists, how did the situation come about? And finally, does it matter? How does it matter? And if it does matter, what can be done about the problems?
How quantitatively do you assess it or size it up, other than to collect more recent examples of anecdotes as opposed to older examples of
anecdotes? First looking at the imbalance, ideological imbalance among the professoriate. There have been survey studies going back to the early 1960s that have asked professors about their political affiliations, their political views. There have also been studies done looking at voter registration and campaign contributions among professors. And what these studies uniformly find is a great imbalance, ideological imbalance on faculty. So, for example, if you look at what you might think of as being among the most conservative of academic disciplines like economics, business administration, military science, even in those disciplines you find ratios of 3-to-1, 4-to-1 between conservative or Republican versus Democratic or liberal professors. But in most disciplines, the imbalance is 20-to-1, 30-to-1, 40-to-1. For example, I'll give you some data. In history departments, if you survey history departments across the country, you find UNC, the ratio is 46-to-1, Cornell 29-to-0, Colorado 27-to-0, Dartmouth 13-to-0. Stanford has a lot of conservatives in its history department because there the ratio is only 22-to-2. And if you look at campaign contributions, for example, you find that the overwhelming majority of professors among those who contribute to campaigns have only contributed to Democratic candidates. And finally, the data, much contrary to what one might suspect, the imbalance has grown worse since the 1960s, so that faculties are actually more imbalanced today than they were back in the heyday of liberalism, the 1960s and 1970s.
When you say in those some economics, business, and military science that the ratio was 3 or 4-to-1, was that in favor of conservatives or in favor of self-described liberals?
In favor of liberals.
Oh, I see. And in the others, it's upwards of 20 or so to 1.
20, 30, 40 to 1.
Just because you have maybe 9 registered Democrats to 1 registered Republican in a political science department, does that necessarily mean anything? How far can you go to infer that automatically assumes or means bias?
Well, first of all, it doesn't necessarily mean bias, and we can talk about two kinds of bias. We can talk about bias in terms of who's hired onto faculties, and we can talk about bias in terms of what's going on in their scholarship and their teaching. So let me begin by talking about the first kind of bias, and then I'll move on to the second. In the book, we also report some large-scale empirical studies looking at possible discrimination against conservatives in admission to graduate school or in faculty hiring. And the studies are rather complex. I don't have time to go into all the details, but these studies have involved thousands of participants at a variety of colleges and universities across the country. And with respect to graduate school admissions, a large-scale survey of college seniors, 15,000 across various colleges and universities, finds that when comparing the conservative as against the liberal students, first of all, they have virtually identical SAT and GPA, sort of refuting the notion that fewer conservatives go on to graduate school because they're less intelligent or less academically inclined. But the conservative students do report having less close relationships with their professors, fewer opportunities to do research with their professors. And I think that makes sense if you think about it, because if you're a conservative student who wants to do research from a conservative point of view or work on some advocacy project with a professor from a conservative perspective, who are you going to find among your professors who's either willing or able to mentor you on that? And working closely with faculty on research is critically important to graduate education, getting accepted into graduate school, wanting to pursue a graduate career, and so forth. Another study that was in the book looked at possible discrimination in faculty hiring, did a regression analysis, and found that everything else being equal, the conservative applicant has to publish more and so forth to get the same job, and that, in fact, conservative young professors are underplaced relative to their liberal peers in terms of the jobs that they land. And there are some other studies as well which would imply discrimination in faculty hiring. And I want to emphasize, too, that the kinds of disciplines, as you mentioned, where it's most problematic is the social sciences and humanities. In disciplines like biology or chemistry, it probably doesn't matter all that much what the professor's political ideology is. But in disciplines that deal very heavily with public policy issues, controversial social issues, it's important from the standpoint, and now let me move on to the second kind of bias in terms of what goes on in the classroom and scholarship. If you look at the kind of research that professors do, what you find is that particularly when it comes to social issues and public policy issues, professors tend to choose topics that have some personal meaning for them, that they have a personal interest in. And so consequently, it's only natural that if you're a liberal professor, you're probably going to want to research a topic from a more liberal perspective. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing nefarious about that. It's only natural. And similarly, in terms of what you teach in the classroom, you're going to be most familiar with teaching from a perspective that you're more familiar with and feel more comfortable with. So if you don't get more conservatives, and again, I'm defining conservative to mean anything right of center. If you don't get more conservatives in academia, you're going to be necessarily seeing less scholarship and teaching done that gives voice to the conservative perspective. And you can point to a lot of anecdotes and experiences from students and faculty colleagues which would attest to this being the case.
I spoke to some older professors who are now retired and who have been teaching for decades and that went to college back in, say, the 60s or the 1950s. As you said before, there were many left-leaning academics even at that time. But he said the startling difference is that if you walked into their class, you were hard-pressed to know what their political views were or where they stood. And so it came down to a matter of professionalism. So even if they were left-leaning, even if all of them were, if you didn't know it and they challenged your views equally, then you got the university experience and education that you're paying for. So what changed that? In other words, can you have that kind of a university and still have a ratio of 10-to-1 liberals to conservatives? Or is it just impossible in your opinion because there's just too much like-minded groupthink type of mentality going on?
I think you're never fully going to give voice to the conservative perspective unless you get more conservatives in academia. So it's not a question of bias. It's not so much a question of liberal professors stifling dissent or stifling conservative viewpoints. It's just that professor isn't going to be more than likely conducting scholarship from a conservative point of view on the important social and policy issues of the day. There's less opportunity for students to get involved in that kind of scholarship, to know about that kind of research. And our colleges and universities are one of the major producers of research and development in the country. And so if you have research on policy questions coming out of the colleges and universities that's only gives voice to one side of the question, that really limits the range of ideas that students are exposed to in the classroom, and then the public as consumers of research gets. That's why we've seen in the last 3 decades or so the development of some conservative research think tanks, mainly in the D.C. area, such as the Heritage Foundation, AEI, and so forth, that have come in to fill that void. But the other kind of bias does occur. I want to be clear in saying I think most professors, including most liberal professors, strive to be unbiased in the classroom. I wouldn't, my experience has not been otherwise. But there are some professors, you are quite correct, who view the classroom as, and they even write about this in some of their scholarship, view the classroom as a vehicle for engaging in social change, social activism, getting students involved in that. And of course, it's typically social activism or social change from the liberal point of view. So there is some of that kind of bias that goes on as well.
I'm sure this has probably ruffled a lot of feathers in academia. What has been the reaction, number one, that you could see directly? And number two, how do you react or respond to the claim that, well, projects like yours are just funded by big conservative money coming down by way of institutions like American Enterprise Institute and things like that, as opposed to genuine grassroots inside the academia research?
Well, you're correct. The book that we're discussing today was published by the American Enterprise Institute. The authors who contributed to the book are well-known academics, well-known researchers in their field. I have written previously on this topic in scholarly publications in psychology and other disciplines. This is my first publication published by AEI or any organization like that. And the reaction that I've gotten from my previous work as well as this one has been very positive, actually, from the academic community. I've presented it in a number of forums and gotten a lot of feedback about it. And it's been very positive. I think most of my colleagues recognize it as a legitimate issue and concern. I think where people differ is on the issue of how did it come about. So, for example, is there not discrimination in faculty hiring? Is there a self-selection effect whereby conservatives self-select out of the professoriate? And also differences on what, if anything, should be done about it. So I think many, if not most, people agree that it is an issue, that there are these kinds of disparities. There is a lack of voice given to conservative points of view in academia, but I think the real debate comes down to how did this state of affairs come about? And of course, that issue informs the question of what, if anything, should be done about it.
There have been scores of scholars and as well as pundits inside and outside of academia that have been pointing this out now for decades. It's been going on arguably for decades, but it never has changed. It never seems to go away. There's never a single incident or event that changes drastically the landscape of higher education.
Sure.
How will this book necessarily change anything, or is it going to be just another small, drip and drab series of anecdotes saying, "Oh, look, there's political correctness"?
Well, I'm not sure that it will change anything. Hopefully, it will, but I certainly don't know that. I think what's unique about this book are two things. First of all, that we do go beyond the anecdote and we document the problem in a very systematic, large-scale way. The book is divided into 3 sections. The first section it contains these large-scale empirical studies that I mentioned briefly. The second section, we explore how the problem affects scholarship and teaching in some key representative liberal arts disciplines, history, political science, English, for example. And in the third section, we talk about possible reforms, things that can be done to change the situation. So I think what's unique is by going beyond the anecdote to document it in a large-scale, systematic way, show the effects it does have on scholarship and teaching, examples of that, and then talk about some specific concrete proposals for reforms, which include, for example, getting trustees and alumni more heavily involved in the governance of colleges and universities, particularly hiring and curricular issues, the establishment of various new centers and departments at various schools and universities that can take up public policy issues from perspectives different than what you typically see in academia today. Greater accountability measures on the part of colleges and universities, and some other measures as well. So I think by documenting the problem in a more systematic, empirical way, and by proposing some specific and very doable reforms that can be done, I think that's what makes this book a little different than what you've seen in the past.
How widespread is the problem today? Do you think it's gotten better or worse, or what's the trajectory on today going forward?
Well, certainly if you look at the data that I referred to on faculty imbalances and ideology, the problem has gotten worse since the 1960s or 70s. The imbalance seems to have grown. There seems to have been a snowball effect that's gone on. But on the other hand, in recent years, you've seen some reform efforts start to take hold. So, for example, the National Council of Trustees and Alumni, I think you interviewed Ann Neal previously on your show, is an organization that's taken up a lot of these efforts. So I think the public, there's been a lot of discussion of this issue just in the last couple years. Myself and my co-editors, for example, have had op-eds appear in major newspapers around the country on this issue. So I think it's an issue that's getting greater attention, and so on the one hand, the data would suggest the problem has gotten more significant in recent years, but on the other hand, there are some reform efforts that I think are starting to take hold.
Richard Redding, co-author and co-editor of The Politically Correct University, Problem, Scope, and Reforms. I want to thank you for joining us today.
Sure, thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right, I'm your host, Andy Nash. This has been InsideAcademia.tv. Please join us again next week, as every week, as we take you for a look behind the ivory curtain.